Frogman Friday.
Yeah, boy. What's up, guys? It's that time again. Welcome to the Frogman Friday show.
Presented by Transcend, the best peptide and hormone therapy. They put your health first so you can live more and worry less. Go to transcendcompany.com/Birdman to begin your wellness transformation today.
Today, our badass guest is Joe Kent. He served 20 years as a Green Beret and a CIA Paramilitary Ops officer, exiting service as a Chief Warrant Officer 3. Joe is running for Congress in this great state of Washington, District 3, and is the Republican nominee for the 2024 Congressional Election. You can follow Joe on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube. And to take a deeper dive and contribute towards his campaign, go check out joekentforcongress.com. Fast note, a dear friend of mine and retired Green Beret and I were talking this morning about the fact that Joe has a legendary hairdo. You know us SEALs love our hair. Brother, welcome to the show.
That's an awesome intro right there, man. I'll take that. Definitely coming from a SEAL. It's always good to get the hair check.
Oh, I digress. So let's talk real quick about transition because, everybody, the unique thing about special operations guys is everybody's got a real entrepreneurial spirit. And I love to see the diversity and the things that guys get into. And it's just like we stop and then like, cool, I was a Navy SEAL. Now I'm doing this. Well, how did you even get there? So what was your transition out of the service? You've got a lifelong of service. What did that look like?
So mine was pretty unconventional and unplanned. I think most people who are familiar with my story know my late wife was killed fighting ISIS in Syria. She was a Navy cryptologist serving with one of the task forces. And so that kind of yanked me out of service. I really had not planned on transitioning at all. My transition was retiring from the military on a Friday and then taking a job immediately at the CIA as a paramilitary guy, which, I'm here in the team house essentially. So you guys understand how natural that transition is. When I say that to civilians, they're like, wow, that's some crazy cloak and dagger stuff. And I'm like, no, actually, it's really the most natural thing in the world is to stay in the contracting realm, to go be a CIA guy like I was doing. The challenging thing, and this was the case for me too, was having a clean break into the civilian world. So the forcing function of losing my late wife and having two young sons at home, that made me step away from, that took the option of being able to go overseas and ply my former trade in a very comfortable way for me off the table completely. So really, after Shannon was killed, I moved back here to the Northwest where I'm from and said, okay, step one was getting my kids closer to my family. Step two is we'll figure out the rest later. So really, it was kind of one foot in front of the other. And then really just sort of like, I kind of equate this to 9/11. The country started falling apart in 2020. And I had never considered getting into politics before, but just seeing how our country was just being ripped apart, multiple factors. There was the riots, there was what our government was doing through COVID, the election of 2020. It really dawned on me. It was like, well, the fight was overseas. You're a warrior. The fight's here now. It's political, but you need to get involved just like you had to get involved during the wars that we fought, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. We all remember the day that we heard about your wife, my teammate, Scotty Wirtz, that were killed. And, I'm glad that there was so much press around it because it'll always live there for people to remember and to memorialize and keep speaking their names. It's devastating, man. And for you, like most of the guys that transition out of the military, like, yeah, I've either had enough combat or I've broken too many bones and my body's given out, or they're telling me I'm too fat now or whatever. But you had a very, very difficult step out of the military. So when you got out and had to deal with all of this unrest within the country and losing your wife, what was your thought process? Like, were you, I have to get a job, I have to get going, or what was that like, man?
So right away after Shannon was killed, I reflected pretty heavily. I was like, I can't continue to deploy and to go overseas. And Shannon and I had those conversations before. She was one of the first people to look at me and be like, you were already in for 20 years. You got to do more than most people did. You've done more than most people have done. I never felt like I did enough. And she was just like, look, at some point, you're going to have to figure out who you are outside the military. And I did the, very mature thing of not listening to her and saying, no, I'm going to, yeah, that sounds great. We'll readdress that here in like 10, 15 years. after I go on this separate adventure. And so after she was killed, I was like, damn, she was right. She was 100% right. I had a good career. There's only so many times you can roll the dice. I have young kids at home. Coming from our communities, I didn't get married until later on. I didn't have kids until later on, but I watched so many guys basically have to leave their kids every single year and watch their kids be raised, by their mom. And unfortunately, a lot of those marriages failed. And so in losing Shannon, I was like, well, the one thing that I have left is my sons. And so I've got to prioritize them. So that was my main goal. And I said, you know what, I'll figure out the rest later on, as uncomfortable as that is, because I think coming from our community, we like to have plans. We like to have contingencies, and we like to know that, hey, I'm going to take some risk, but that risk is mitigated by these other factors. So I had to put a little confidence in myself and say, hey, I'll figure out the rest later on. I initially got a decent job as a project manager, something I was not formally trained in, but I think coming from the military, especially with a background in just basic leadership and task management, I think that's a job that most of us can kind of figure out. And it was a good gig. It was working from home. It let me put the kids first. I'm very grateful for that opportunity. But then when the country really started unraveling, man, it was frightening, but also at the same time, it was kind of familiar. It was like, okay, there's a lot of chaos right now. And now that I'm in the civilian community, I can see a lot of people don't understand what this chaos is. But I hate to, I'm not trying to be cliche, but like there's a certain level of comfort that we have in chaos, and that's not something that we have because it's been gifted to us or whatever. We got that through repetitions over fighting a war for 20 plus years, through all the training evolutions that we did. So that's where I really felt like I was being called once again to serve in a very different capacity. And again, there's that roll the dice kind of confidence you have to have of like, well, I don't know what it takes to run for office, but man, if some of these other guys can figure it out, I can figure it out too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the fact that your primary job was your children. Being a dad is exceptional. I have two boys myself, and it's the hardest thing in the world too, because I thought I had patience as a sniper and a special operator. And then I met my children and I was like, wow, I'm so far behind where I thought I was. Yeah. So getting into this now, because none of us, I think maybe 99.9% of the special ops guys get out and they're like, I'm not running for office. And for me, like I would be fired the first day because that's just not me. Right. I'm a skateboarder. People don't take me seriously. But then I look at a guy like you who's super articulate, who's driven, who's motivated, who serves. You clearly stick with things for a lifetime because 20 years in the service plus external at the CIA. I mean, you've done some amazing things. What was it like when you made that decision to say, I'm doing this, I'm stepping in, and then not knowing anything about it? What did that look like for you?
It can be intimidating, but luckily, I think having the backgrounds that we have, I mean, when you're staring down the barrel day one in the Army or the Navy, and you're like, I want to be a SEAL, I want to be a Green Beret, like that's super intimidating. But what I learned in the military was like, don't worry about that overarching goal. Keep it in the back of your mind, but take the first step. Get through today, get through whatever boot camp or like whatever little evolution you have to get through, while keeping your main goal in mind. But don't get wrapped around the axle. Like when I first said, hey, I'm going to run for Congress, there was 100 people telling me like, you need to be able to raise $3-4 million. And I'm like, dude, I don't know how to raise $1,000. But like there's gotta be a way to do it because these other folks have. So really, I just tried to take it like how to eat an elephant one bite at a time, whatever cliche you want to use. I just tried to keep those in mind. Like, hey, we just got to get through this first FEC filing and make sure we don't screw that thing up. So let's get some resources to do that. But really, I mean, with politics, it kind of ties in a little bit with being a Green Beret. The more attached you are to the ground level, to understanding what people are feeling, what issues matter the most to them, the better equipped you're going to be. So I was like, okay, I know job one is I need to start showing up to places and listening to people. And so can I go to different Republican meetings? Can I go to city council meetings, school board meetings, those types of things? And once I started getting that type of motion and getting armed with information and contacts in the community, again, that felt very familiar from our background in special operations. I was like, okay, this is doable. This is not going to be easy, but I do at least understand these first steps here. And there's a million and one little stories and different obstacles I had along the way that apply specifically to running for office. But I think that applies kind of anywhere in life. Like, don't get wrapped around the axle about your overall goal. get through the day, make small goals and work towards those.
Well, the one thing that you mentioned there that was really key that I've seen both sides of this spectrum, because we talk about it now, that politicians really, a lot of them are in it for themselves, and they're operating from their own fundamentals, their own mindset, and their own what they want out of this. And you said going to sit down with city council and going to sit down with the people of the town to understand what those needs are. That's a great starting point, and that's huge for people to hear, because we need politicians that are actually going to do that stuff, because you guys are the representatives for that community. And so us being able to feel like we can voice our opinions and then be heard, I mean, it seems like it's lost in this country right now. So it's awesome for you to step
really
up and
is,
say
man.
that.
And a lot of that is just because money drives so much politics. I mean, you can come, unfortunately, I hate to say this, you can go and you can win a lot of these races with millions of dollars by just flooding the advertising market with your message. And that's unfortunately how a lot of this gets done. And then also it's a good old boy network. I mean, people don't like guys like us just showing up as outsiders, whether you're a special operator, a businessman, whatever. If you're an outsider, and we saw this on a very macro level with Donald Trump, if you just show up on the scene and you're like, hey, actually, I think you guys are doing it wrong, people are not going to be happy about that, especially if they are very, very invested in selecting who the politicians are by funding a lot of the campaigns. You're going to hit a lot of resistance. But it's very doable to break through that, because the people that actually get to cast their ballots, they really, really crave that honest interaction. And I found even people who disagree with some of the things I stand for, or some of the positions I've taken, they still respect the fact that, like, I'll show up and I'll listen to them. And that right there, just being able to go out there and make those connections, I credit that with all the progress I've been able to make just while I run for office.
That's awesome, man. Well, I think, for me, like when I see guys like you running, and it's like you're just getting down at the ground level. Same with Congressman Derek Van Orden, did somewhat similar things moving through his campaign, to really understand what the people need. I think people are waking up now. I think people are really starting to wake up and see what's happening and what's at stake. So to have a fresh group of people who actually give a crap about, like, this is what we need to do to fix America, get America squaring on the right trajectory, it's going to come from warfighters like you who've been there, done that, man. What are some of your principles, your values, things that you're running? What are some of the biggest points of concern that made you actually step into the ring to do this?
Really, it was that our elected officials just weren't listening to we the people. So I got into politics as 2020 was kind of imploding. My late wife, her and Scott and John Farmer and Gadir Tahir, the four Americans that were killed there, they were killed a month after Trump tried to get our troops out of Syria. We had a lot of unelected bureaucrats that turned against Trump. A lot of them brag about it now, to leave our troops in Syria. And so I initially started speaking up, because I was like, hey, this guy, President Trump, who the people elected to be the commander in chief, he was disobeyed by these unelected bureaucrats. Not to mention the fact that this guy is right about our current strategy in the Middle East, because he was criticized heavily for being an outsider. So I felt it was important to start speaking out then, especially with my background. Like, one of the first times I met Trump, I was just like, hey, you don't know who I am, but I've been literally fighting these wars for as long as they've been going on. And you're getting it right. You're an outsider, but your assessment that we are messing these things up and the American people are benefiting from it, that's actually correct. And, I didn't think anything would come from that, but that led me to do some advisory work, but then work heavily on the Trump campaign. And then as 2020 imploded, my Republican representative, whose district I lived in, who I voted for, she did the whole Trump impeachment thing. And she took a bunch of other bad votes before that, but she did the Trump impeachment vote. And I was just like, okay, we've got to do something about this. And because I was listening to people here in the district, my friends, my neighbors, and they were just like, well, none of us are happy about that. And I'm like, okay, guys, if none of us are happy about this, the answer can't be that we let her keep her job. That's not the way this is supposed to work. And there was nobody really stepping forward to, like, actually primary her. So I just said, okay, in the absence of orders, I'm going to attack. But my starting principle is going to be that I'm going to go out and I'm going to actually listen to people, and I'm going to represent them, because that's what's missing in Washington, D.C. And I think that gap that we have between our elected officials and the people, it's how we've gotten into a situation where we're $35 trillion in debt. The inflation keeps running up. It's pricing people out of their homes. It's literally taking food out of their mouths. We have a wide open southern border. We have endless wars. We have a government that basically has no problem sending hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, but then splits hairs on whether or not they can repair a bridge or a road in our districts. I think that gap right there is how we got to this point. So really just trying to represent the people and serve them. I mean, that's my starting premise. Just like we had on the teams, man. You went to war for the man on your left and right. You didn't go to war. You know, we went for the flag. We were patriotic, but really at the end of the day, what kept you moving forward was the man on your left and right. And so that's very much how I view my fight to get into Congress.
See, I love that, and you're right, because you don't understand that. Like when I showed up to SEAL training, I mean, all I knew about was buds. SEAL training. I didn't know anything about what it was to be a Navy SEAL. It's totally two different things. So I'm like, yes, I'm going to fight for America. I'm going to wear my flag proudly and all this good stuff. And then I get there and we finally deploy. And once you've deployed and you've actually been in combat in some pretty surreal scenarios, that's when you're like, okay, it's really left and right here. I'm not fighting for the politicians. We are here engaged in combat because this is a known bomb maker or whoever it is, and they got to go. And so we're going to do it here, and we're going to bring our teammates here back safely. So I love that approach, man. That's awesome. Tell people what they need to know, because there's still a lot of people who just refuse to go do research. Like when I talked to my wife about when it was between Trump and Hillary Clinton, I was like, who are you voting for? And she's like, well, I don't know. I said, okay, well, here's the deal. Instead of me forcing anything on anybody, I say, why don't you go do your research and look at both sides, and then come back and look at everything on those web pages and tell me why you think this is the best choice. Not because I want to tell you who to choose, but so you're making educated decisions. So what do people need to know, not just about this election, but about government in general, things that people need to understand, maybe why we're falling apart, maybe things that we could all be doing as taxpayers to help Congress? Tell us things that we need to know.
I think the big thing is stop listening to the mainstream media. I mean, so already if they're listening to your podcast or just listening to podcasts in general, I feel like those types of people are going to have a leg up than your average like New York Times reader and CNN watcher. Because right now, I think the advantage that we have, as chaotic and bad as things are right now in 2024, the gift of that chaos is that reality doesn't lie. Go to the grocery store, go to the gas pump. Like, can anyone actually afford this? And are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? So you can dislike Trump. You can dislike Republicans. You can dislike, most of what I say. Go to the grocery store, go to the gas pump. Like, that is a stark difference than what it was just 4 years ago. And start your research there. I mean, if you just look at the way government spends money, that we're spending between 2 to 2.5 trillion over what we take in tax income, that's something that you and I wouldn't be allowed to do in our own personal lives. The credit card company would cut us off. Yep. You and I can't print money, but the government can. And that's what drives inflation. The more money they print, the more expensive everything gets. And even if you're making the same amount of money or maybe even a little bit more, your dollar doesn't go as far. That's pretty basic right there. And I'd say the same thing with general law and order and crime and chaos. I mean, look, we opened the border up. That's basically irrefutable at this point. I mean, you can go back and you can look at Biden and Harris's statements, and basically every Democrat, my opponent included, voted to keep that border open. And we've had fentanyl that has killed around 100,000 Americans every single year Biden's been in office. And just think about that. I mean, 100,000 Americans being killed by a substance the drug cartels are putting across the border. The Chinese Communist Party, they give the ingredients for the fentanyl, and that's killing 100,000 Americans a year. We went to war for 20 plus years, our wars in the Middle East, because of 9/11. 3,000 Americans tragically killed, a little bit less than 3,000 Americans tragically killed on one day. We've had 100,000 Americans killed every single year because of this fentanyl and this open border. I mean, that should make every single American right now just absolutely furious. And we can always argue about what role the federal government has, but what I think is pretty irrefutable, the federal government should at least secure our borders. Like, job number one, make sure we're not getting invaded. But after that, okay, then we can have some arguments about like tax policy and these other policies here and there. But their most basic job is to secure our borders. And when they're not doing that, as a matter of fact, they're facilitating and enabling the invasion of our country. We've got a serious problem. And again, I say give it the old sniff test. Like 4 years ago, did we have this problem? We had some problems on the border, but we didn't have a massive invasion. We had people dying from opioid and fentanyl overdoses, but not 100,000 plus per year. The crazy thing right now, usually when you have, a presidential election, you've got at least one person who's untested, who's never held the job before. And sometimes you even have two, like we had in 2016. We had two people who had never held the job before, and they were both saying, well, I might do this. Well, I stand for this. And it's all kind of abstract or in theory. We don't have that right now. I mean, President Trump, running on the Republican ticket, had the job for 4 years. And there's plenty of criticisms that you can make of how Trump conducted himself and ran things, for the 4 years he was in power. However, if you just look at the basic fundamentals, most Americans' lives were better. Kamala Harris is the VP right now. Up until a couple months ago, it was Joe Biden. Like, there are people with executive branch experience that are on the top of the ticket right now. And the proposal that Republicans are laying out right now for the American people, it's been tried and tested, and I think it stands up to being more beneficial to the American people than what the Democrats have been able to put forward for the 4 years that they've been in control. So I would just say tune out the mainstream media and all the spin coming from both sides. Don't even, you don't need to listen to candidates. You don't even really necessarily need to listen to President Trump. Just look at the basic data on how your life has degraded in the last 4 years. And I think that's where the answers are right there.
I love that you put it that way, because you're right. I mean, this is something that I go back and forth with people on, is like, have you ever been friends with the President of the United States? And they'll say, well, no. I say, so why do you have to love him? Are you guys trying to be friends? Like, it's about policy. Are they performing what they said they were set out to do? And the track record shows it's as clear as day. So on a more localized scale, what are you working on in the state of Washington? What are some of your objectives there?
So we've got pretty major issues with law and order. I mean, the open border crisis, even though we're pretty far away from the southern border, obviously, it's really affected us because Washington for a very long time has been a sanctuary state. So we've really served as a vector for a lot of the illicit activity. A lot of the drugs that come across the border in the San Diego area, they shoot right up I-5 into our backyard. We've seen just a massive uptick in crime. So the law and order, the open border, major issue. Inflation really hits us twice here because in addition to everything that the Democrats at the federal level have done, we have an absolute insane state government that puts on gas taxes, additional taxes. And so the economy here is in a bad shape. Two really major local issues that we have is that the bridge between Oregon and Washington, that's actually in our district on along I-5. Now, the federal government has basically ignored this bridge, which is clear-cut federal nexus because it's interstate commerce, it's I-5. They're letting Oregon and Washington essentially argue over table scraps for it, and the federal government's refusing to come in a meaningful way. So when I get to Congress, something I really want to advocate for is us building a third bridge across the Columbia River to actually give us some real congestion relief and to divert the traffic around Vancouver that's on the Washington side, then around Portland on the Oregon side. This is the type of things that I think our federal government should be doing, as opposed to finding a new country to send billions of dollars to every single year. It's funny because the government will be like, well, we don't have enough money for this new bridge, but they'll work until midnight to send $86 billion overseas. And that's the priority of the federal government. So that's a big one. Another major issue that we have is just too much federal regulation involved in our natural resources. This is timber country, USA, and due to excessive government regulation, our timber industry essentially was sacrificed on the altar of environmentalism. And I'd say the 30 plus year experiment that we've been running on not harvesting timber from our forests, if you just look at all the data, it's failed. Every single summer we have these catastrophic wildfires because the timber isn't being cleared out. The service roads that the logging companies used to maintain, those aren't even maintained anymore. So when fires are detected, it's almost impossible to get crews to them. Same issue we have on the Columbia River and a lot of its tributaries. We've had a lot of the predators that eat up our salmon. They've been put on the endangered species list, and they've ran roughshod over our salmon population. And fishing is a huge industry here, multi-million-dollar per year, and that industry is really being harmed by excessive federal government regulation. So I want to get the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. out of the regulatory business of small businesses throughout the country, but in particular our natural resources way out here in Washington State, because when we control those things locally, we're in a much better position to manage them in a way that actually benefits the environment and the people.
Wow. Well, you know your stuff. Let me ask you this major question, which is always most important, is how can we help you?
Yeah, that's a big one, man. These elections are won, unfortunately, with dollars. I was outspent. I had $14 million spent against me in the Republican primary last time that I won. But by the end of it, we were flat. We were actually in debt. But this time we're not anywhere near that bad of a situation. We're not in debt, but my opponent still has probably about $5 million more than I do, because the Democrats, if you watch any kind of election, they never want for money. All of the corporate interests that are destroying the country, whether it's the military industrial complex, big pharma, big tech, they love pouring money into these Democrats, and my opponent's no different. So anything that you guys can, your audience can donate, is greatly appreciated. And there's no donation that's too small. In my last campaign, we raised about $3.5 million, and it was all from small dollar contributions. Our average donation was $51. So people will give me $20 and they'll be like, man, I'm sorry, I can't do more. I wish I could do more. And I'm like, no, that actually is great. Because if I get 10, $20 from, people throughout the country who like my message and want to see real change, that's enough to fight back against the corporate interests. So if you go to joekentforcongress.com, that's kind of the touch point for donations.
It's amazing, man. All right. Well, we're going to push that out for sure. And we're going to talk offline about some other ways to help you out there. It's pretty awesome, man. I always like to, end on this, because this is always, bringing the human side to any kind of conversation. It's always important. Obviously, you've been sharing a little bit of your past and being completely human. I, believe it or not, have had guys on who they freeze up on camera and then they become robots. And I'm like, hey, let's talk about you for a second. Let's relax a little bit. One thing I always ask guys, though, because this is always important, is everybody looks at guys like you as a hero. And for all intents and purposes, for you to be able to do 20 years during all wartime in a special operations unit, that is the definition of heroism. You don't have to go and stand on a grenade, or you don't have to go storm a battlefield or whatever to be considered a hero to the majority of America. But I would like to know a hero story from you. Who is your hero and why?
That's a pretty easy one, man. I mean, I served with heroes for my entire career. So I appreciate, everything you said about serving for 20 plus years and all more. But I was always around like great guys from the time I came in until the time I left. I was just around phenomenal humans. I felt like I was just like an average dude showing up to work, trying not to get fired. But my hero is my late wife, Shannon. She enlisted right after 9/11. Her father and her uncle were both ground zero first responders, and her younger brother too. They did what so many Americans did. They said, like, my country, my city got attacked. Like, put me in, coach. I'm going to go do something. And Shannon knew she had a knack for languages. And she was like, look, I'm going to guess that not a lot of people are volunteering to go learn Arabic right now. I'll go do that. And she really found a niche on the intel side, because she could speak the Iraqi dialect. She really dove deeply into both human intelligence, so going out and working assets, but in particular building relationships with women in the Middle East, because that was a big gap that we had, because most dudes look like me and you, and the women over in the Middle East they're not allowed to talk to us, so we were missing out on half that intel picture. And Shannon created quite the name for herself and had a pretty storied special operations career even before I met her. And then she ended up doing a lot more great things. When her country called upon her to go back and to go fight, she could have gotten out of the deployment, but her duty, she felt, was to her country, and to say, hey, if someone's going to go over there, it's going to be me. I'm going to do the best that I can. And ultimately, she gave her life for her nation alongside Scott Wirtz and John Farmer and Gadir Taher. But she will always be my hero, especially for the perspective that she gave me as I was getting out of the military, saying that, hey, like, you exist outside of all of this, and you need to become someone outside of this military personality or the special operations, whatever personality. It's something that I still think about pretty much every day, and that's a gift that she gave me. So Shannon will always be my hero.
Thank you for sharing, brother. Yeah, I was looking at some of her service, and I was trying to figure out, she worked with the SEAL team, so I was trying to figure out when she deployed, and it says that 2007 was a deployment with the SEAL teams, and I'm like, I was deployed in 2007. I'm trying to think of, did we ever run into each other? And do you happen to know a team that she was with particularly?
So in 2007, she started out up at the Siege of Sodif, and then she was working down in the joint targeting area. And then whatever it was an East Coast team. I always get my East and West Coast teams mixed up.
Yeah.
So whatever team was out there from the East Coast, and this is like right before they stood up the special reconnaissance teams, or support, whatever they were called, support activities before that.
Yeah.
And then so they gave her the invite on that trip, because she was technically still assigned to NSA at Fort Gordon. And so she got the invite on that trip from working with, I want to say SEAL Team 8, but I don't know if that's accurate.
Yeah, very well could be the 8 or 10 for sure. Yeah. So all the odd number teams are on the West Coast, even on the East. So but yeah, that's definitely wasn't us, but it was like, oh, times aligned. We were both there, and that was my first deployment where I didn't actually get injured, where I actually got to stay on the deployment the whole time. So it was quite an amazing thing. So, hey man, I appreciate you. I know that you are so busy, and we're gonna blast you out. We're gonna share this with everybody, and for anybody who's looking to vote and sponsor somebody who actually gives a crap about our nation, who fought for our nation, and is just a good human being, go vote for Joe Kent. If you're not in his district and you can't vote for him, you can still make a donation. So go to Joe Kent. What is it? Joe Kent for Congress. Let me reset that real quick. For those of you who want to support, go to joekentforcongress.com. Give him a donation. No size is too small. No size is too big. So we're going to help you out, brother. Appreciate you doing what you're doing. And thanks for your service, brother.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, man.
Frogman.